Today's game is a game between Magnus Carlsen and Chu from China, a strong grandmaster rated over 2,600. This was played on a title Tuesday. And in this game, we'll see Grandmaster Chu play g6 and fianchetto his bishop on the king side. And at some point in the game, he decides to trade off that dark squared bishop, leaving dark squared weaknesses around his king. And let's watch and see how Magnus craftily, skillfully exploits this decision by his opponent. Let us jump right in. Magnus with white begins with the move e4. c5 is played by Grandmaster Chu. Knight to f3, d6, and bishop to b5 check. The Moscow variation, not going into the more complex main lines of the open Sicilian, although this is complicated enough. Knight to d7 is played here. This is when black wants to keep things complicated. When they want to simplify, they'll usually play the bishop to d7. So knight to d7, and Magnus plays a4. And these kind of space-gaining moves on the side of the board have become very popular in chess because the strongest computers like to do them, so humans are now doing it as well. Knight g to f6, aiming at the e4 pawn, knight to c3, defending it, and now g6, setting up that kingside fianchetto. The bishop can come to g7. Obviously, this diagonal is occupied by pawns, so you place it on this longer diagonal where it has more potential. Magnus plays a5, continues to gain space on the queen side, bishop g7, and then, again, a6. Now, in this position, his opponent takes the pawn, and in my database, this is actually a novelty. Players have not wanted to take the pawn in the past, I guess for fear that they're opening up the file and creating a weakness on a7. But in this case, Grandmaster Chu wants to do it. So bishop takes a6, bishop takes, rook takes, and he does have pressure on black's a7 pawn, but the light squared bishops are off the board. Black has a fine position and can play in the center, attacking white structure. Castles, castles, and now knight to e8. The idea basically, not only does he unveil the dark squared bishop, but this knight can go to c7 and hit that bishop, that rook at a6 and kick it away. b3 with the idea of playing bishop to b2 and challenging that bishop on g7. Knight to c7 hits the rook. The rook comes back to a2. And now here, black makes a very committal decision. He actually gives up his dark squared bishop to damage white's pawn structure. Bishop takes knight. A very risky choice. And we will see what his idea is behind this here in a minute. But it probably was a mistake when all was said and done. dc3 and now a5. I believe what he's trying to do is this. He wants to play c4, and that would be a pawn sacrifice, but it would create tripled isolated pawns for white, and then black's a pawn would be completely passed. Actually, it's a fairly innovative idea and pretty strong if you can pull it off tactically. Let's see if Carlsen can do something about that. First, he plays c4. So now this pawn cannot advance to c4 and create that structural damage. Also, it opens up this dark square diagonal. So now Magnus might be able to put some pressure on these newly weakened kingside dark squares, weakened because he gave up that bishop. a4, breaking up white's queenside pawns. It costs him a pawn at first, but breaking up of these three pawns is certainly worth that at the moment. Knight to b6, attacking a4 and c4, offering to get one of the pawns back. a5, and now knight c4, recovering that pawn. And white still has the structural damage. However, this white's a pawn is the passed pawn now. Is it more of a weakness or a strength? And again, will Magnus be able to exploit the dark squares? Well, he begins with bishop to h6, aiming right at that rook at f8 and putting some pressure on g7. That's a very dangerous bishop. When the rook moves to e8, then queen to a1, threatening mate on g7. And now that forces black to create another weakness. He has to defend, obviously, against that threat of mate, so he plays f6, blocking the queen and keeping it out, but it also creates some further weaknesses. Now those light squares in the center are weak. Rook to a4 was a decent move after knight takes knight to e5, takes. The queen can go to a2 with check, exploiting that light square diagonal. Carlsen instead plays queen to c3, putting immediate pressure on the knight on c4. And now d5. And if he takes on d5, black's actually doing okay here. After queen takes d5, the knight's coming into b5, and black has some decent activity in this position. So instead, Carlsen just plays the move h3. Obviously, he can't play d4 because that would hang the knight. Uh, so instead, he plays knight to b5, hitting that queen. The queen moves to d3, trying to keep as much pressure on d5 and the knight on c4 as possible. So e6 helps to defend the d5 square. Now rook to b1, aiming directly at the knight at b5. The knight comes to d6, and we see these knights supporting each other, but sometimes that can be fragile because if you put pressure on one knight, the other knight becomes underdefended. So he takes on d5, excuse me. If black responds by taking back, then queen to d5 check, king to h8, now a6, and this pawn is beginning to advance and become very troublesome after rook to a7, queen c5. White is up 2 pawns and is clearly better in this position. The best move was probably rook takes a5 here. Was probably the best idea. What Grandmaster Chu does is he plays e5, creating a passer at d5, but a passer that is blockaded by a knight at d6. If he can maintain that blockade, he probably will be doing pretty well. Magnus immediately challenges it. You go knight to d2 to undermine the knight at c4. If knight takes d2, bishop d2, and white is just better. c4 coming in to protect that pawn. He's got the passer at a5. He's up a pawn. And also, his bishop is on a dark square and could someday challenge that blockader at d6. So instead, rook to a5 is played by black. Rook takes a5, knight to a5, queen to a6. Now, he's putting pressure on the knights on a5 and d6, but he's also threatening rook to b6, which would interfere with the queen's defense of the a5 knight and attack the d6 knight twice. A pretty serious threat, and it's hard for black to deal with it. Queen to c7 was played. Now rook to b6. Not only is it threatening both knights, knight at a5 and d6, there's x-ray pressure against this f6 pawn, weakened because of what happened earlier. He gave up the dark squared bishop. Magnus forced f6 by threatening mate on g7, and now this is a permanent weakness. We see how building a weakness early becomes a problem later. So knight a to b7, that's how you have to, the only thing he can do to really keep his house in order. And when the knights are defending each other like that, all you have to do is put a little pressure to sort of make the structure break. And that's what Magnus does right here. He plays knight to e4. This knight, it's undefended, but it cannot be captured because then after rook takes knight, the rook and queen are coming in and he's going to get destroyed. Also, though, in addition to that threat to d6, he's also threatening the f6 pawn, putting more pressure on that dark square. And basically, black has no choice. He has to give up that pawn. He can't defend that and his knight. So rook to d8, defending the d6 knight, but the f6 pawn now hangs, and Magnus goes ahead and grabs that knight to f6 check. A possibility here is king to h8, but then after, say, bishop g5, creating an x-ray attack or potential discovery attack on the rook at d8, just c4, rook, knight to g4, rook f8, queen to a1, going back to this long diagonal with all sorts of threats. If he tries to block it with c3, then just rook to c6, attacks the queen and the pawn, queen moves, queen takes, and this is about over right here. And if queen takes rook, the rook is hanging, then just, it's a quick mate. Queen takes pawn check, and if king g8, knight to h6 would be checkmate. So because of that, he plays the king to f7, but that hangs his h7 pawn. And in this position with Magnus up 2 pawns, all sorts of pressure, and a much safer king, his opponent, Grandmaster Chu, resigned. A strong lesson for how to exploit those weak dark squares. You put pressure on them, create other weaknesses that later you can exploit in the game. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.